there's grace and grace abounding in all this. I was.
Yeah. And again, this book arises. This isn't an academic treatise so much as it is. I mean, not to diss you. I'm sure it's academic enough, but it's arising out of your lived experience. That's what it is.
Absolutely.
Your decades of lived experience, trying to do this work every day. This is what you're offering. And so just because people have asked, we have sold out of the second batch of the people. So if you would like a copy of the book and you do not have it yet, why don't you just talk to me afterwards, and maybe by the middle of this week or so, we can order another 3, 4, 10, 25, however many copies people want. We'll get them here for you, and you can have one. Okay, so let's start with this, Bill. This is one of the things that I think that we've been really wrestling with when we've been noodling this, and I think it's pretty fundamental to understand, foundational to understanding everything else. So our faith centers in many ways having a personal relationship with God, and we express this through Jesus, through God the Father or the Holy Spirit. But we assume that we can have this personal relationship with God that then fuels the rest of faith. That's not the Muslim way of understanding how we relate with the holy, right? And so tell us more about this, and in your own words.
Well, I think for most of us, the touch point would be the Old Testament and God's revelation in the Old Testament. God was creating a society which reflects his presence, character, etc. And in Islam, it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
The Quran and the Hadith is all about how do people live together in a way that honors God and is the right way of living for the rest of the world.
Right. So this spins out in all kinds. So when we're talking with Muslims, then if we come at it with how do you relate with God, they would find this not only confusing but maybe blasphemous.
Actually,
because we're arrogating ourselves to know something about God that they would say that's impossible,
yeah.
Right?
They would say you cannot know about God. God is unknowable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how does faith as trust then work with that? Like, if I can't know God, how do I have faith?
Well, to some degree, part of the problem is we want to intellectually understand God, which is actually a kind of vain pursuit. But I mean, it's part of our way of doing things, part of our culture. And I mean, there is that emphasis in Christian history. But the Muslims would just say, you can't know God, you can't understand God. The purpose is that we can work together as a community. That's the purpose of the religion, to create a better community. Now, in fact, Christianity also is about creating a better community, but we get focused on the self rather than the community. And that's where the thing starts to break down.
So as we were talking last night, and as we've talked on Tuesday, all world faiths in some way have to address or answer the question of God's transcendence and God's immanence, God's being that is wholly beyond anything we can conceive of and experience, whatever. And yet we know the holy, we know sacred love, we know grace in our lives. Again, we have articulated that as Christians. We've tried to explain that through God became one with us in Jesus. And then we talk about the Spirit, and how would Muslims then answer that question or understand that balance of God as transcendent and yet in some way the purpose, the presence, the power of the holy is with us in some way too?
I think it's reasonable to say, without misrepresenting Islam, that they have a very clear sense of God's omnipresence and God's omnipotence. Everything is up to God, inshallah.
Yeah.
Everything is up to God. And what we do cannot affect what God is going to do or not do. We submit to God. And the basis of the faith, the statement of faith for Muslim is about submitting to God. So I think that the thing that we struggle with is this idea of trying to understand transcendence and immanence. They wouldn't even go there. God is, of course. It's not a thing that we got to figure out. God is, and so it's just not a question.
And God is, and all of life is in God, and so
Yes.
there we have it, right?
Yeah.
So the way we've talked about it, and from your book, it was very helpful to understand that the sort of paradigm, and this is the comparative chart that you have on one of the pages. Tell me how this is right and wrong. So essentially, the basic of the Muslim faith is God spoke to Muhammad. Muhammad wrote it down, and now all the Muslims are that's the revelation, and that's how people follow it, right? So this is the okay, so that's right or wrong, and then what I'm going to get to is so sometimes in our Christian understanding, some of us, well-intended, would say, well, they have Muhammad and we have Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So help us understand how the sort of the flow, I guess you would say, the flow of divine revelation and the Muslims understanding God's way for the world, how that works comparatively to our assumptions about Christianity.
Thank you. To start with, that chart was put together by a Muslim scholar to help Muslims understand how they should relate to Christians.
Okay.
Okay? And the point of God speaking to Muhammad is God spoke the Quran.
Right.
The Quran pre-exists creation with God.
Okay.
Okay? And he gave the Quran to all of the prophets, but all the other ones messed it up, and Muhammad's the only one that got it right.
Okay, good. This is helpful. Right.
And so, they'll talk about Adam and Daniel and all the way down to John the Baptist. But only Muhammad was successful in transmitting that revelation. And it wasn't God, it was Gabriel who spoke to Muhammad.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good, Gabriel.
This is another kind of a thing. Because again, God's transcendent. But I find that it is extremely helpful because we completely erroneously try to do the comparison that the Bible and the Quran, Jesus and Muhammad, and that chart, that God pre-exists creation for us in Trinity. And in respect to this particular thing, Jesus pre-exists creation. Jesus became part of creation, and we read the record of Jesus' life and teaching through his apostles in the Gospels in particular. Or Muhammad is just a guy. He is in the thing parallel to Mary, the human instrument that God used to bring his revelation into the world, which for us it would be Jesus, for them it's the Quran, and the record, which they all study to how to live, is the hadith. Well, for us it's the scriptures. And so there are parallels, but if we're going to parallel our book with their book, it's the hadith, not the Quran. And most of us have never heard of the hadith, but I have a 13-volume hadith and a 7-volume hadith, which is the records of all the sayings of Muhammad about how we should live, and to the minute detail.
So let's go back then to the individual and the whole society, because what we were talking about last night, and what we've tried to understand when we've been noodling is how for Muslims, faith is not really an individual enterprise. It's not really a personal question of am I saved or not, right? It's always within the context of the whole community, which you alluded to this morning with this sermon. We need to understand this parable from the fact that this is about family and society and our places in that as much as anything else. So can you say more about if our motivation as Christians is often a personal salvation, what is salvation as such within the Muslim understanding?
It's just not the way they talk and think. That's one thing. There is a fear of hell.
If you're what?
There is fear of hell.
Fear of hell. Okay.
Yeah. And there is a sense of if I live as a good Muslim, I won't go to hell. So the business is living a good Muslim. It's just the idea of getting to heaven. It's there, but it doesn't shape the theology at all. I mean, that's another weird thing to say for Islam, but it doesn't shape their sense of how the way I live affects the afterlife. They just don't even go in the afterlife, except for the threat of various kinds of quite terrible punishments. Yeah.
Okay. So drilling down on this then a bit, so you talk in your book that one of the motivations from a Christian understanding is the sort of moral sin kind of a position that again, if we need to have ourselves, our hearts, our souls close with God, and then we live out of that, right? That's the kind of Christian position. Then the paradigm that we follow is we sin, and then God does something to save us, right? To make us one. And there are all different kinds of atonement theory within the Christian spectrum, panoply of different kinds of atonement theory. But what we have found striking is that that's not even a question that Muslims really ask.
Oh no.
Right?
But
It's not even a question.
I have to say that atonement theory is particularly Protestant.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
One of the things maybe a little off topic here. Jesus died because he could not have been fully human unless he died. He could not have redeemed death without dying. Mm-hmm. And so it's wrong to talk about Good Friday, the cross, as a saving event without Easter. Mm-hmm. And then also actually the ascension, because finally, God's intention at creation, man and God are together again.
Right. Mm-hmm.
This is a kind of a holistic time view of the creation salvation story. But the idea of being saved comes back to this, frankly, it's Milton and Dante and people like that we get all that influence into our cultural understanding. It's not in the scripture. The scripture has where you go when you die. It's called the place of the dead, or Hades in Greek. And it's underneath. It's down there. The idea of heaven is taken from the Aristotelian understanding of the orbits of the planets, and God's up there with the planets, which at the time was very much prominent in Greek sociological thinking and stuff like that. And we've kind of taken all that, aided by Milton and Dante and a few others, and created this cosmogony of heaven and hell and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, frankly, I have no disrespect for the Catholic Church. I grew up Catholic, and I think it's a wonderful church. But they do major on guilt. And the whole thing about hell and stuff like that just became so much a part of the whole European thrust of religious culture and history. You don't get that in the East. Mm-hmm. Even in Eastern Christianity, you don't get that. Because that cultural, what do we call it, insertion into the historic thing was not part of their cultural experience.
So not to get too esoteric here, but the reality is, and not this is overly simplified, but in the development of Western thought from the Dark Ages into the Reformation, that's when we begin to get the focus on the individual and individual freedoms and all of this. And then we get to the Enlightenment, which accentuates it even more. And we get to France and the founding of our nation, which really enshrines the individual rights.
Yes.
What we're saying is that this isn't even a way...
Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay. This isn't even a frame that most of the rest of the world even operates under.
Exactly.
It's not even, so when we as Christians, and we as particularly Western Christians,
yes.
American Christians in the extreme of Western Christians,
yes.
go to engage with people of other faiths, and we're using this language, it's like they don't even understand what we're talking about, because it's not there. Is this fair?
Right, and frankly, it's the same problem when we meet Orthodox Christians.
Okay, fair enough. Mm-hmm.
As when we meet Muslims, because our framework, our basis of understanding our relationship with God is this cultural,
right.
I was going to say accretion, that's probably
Yeah,
not right,
sure.
but you know, we've added all this stuff in.
So one of the first things that all of us need to do with our own personal faith, and especially in interfaith dialogue, is to become aware of how our faith is always inevitably, unavoidably contextualized.
Absolutely.
Fair enough?
Yes.
How have you found that challenging in your own personal life, growing up in America, going into Egypt, and then...
Well, in the end of the day, the challenge is to divest the self. And it comes back to what Jesus said. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And I have found that interacting with, relating to, befriending Muslims, the self thing just gets in the way all the time. There is always the awareness of I'm different, I come from a different culture and all this kind of stuff, and a different religion. But the thing is, it's not a competition, it's not I'm right, you're wrong, and once we get past some of that stuff, and I'll say, I'm privileged to have a level of acceptance amongst Muslims, and Arab Christians, partly because I learned their language. Mm-hmm. I mean, and there's more to learning a language than vocabulary. It's gestures, it's euphemisms, this is how you say things, and there's assumptions of how people interact that are all part of it. You don't shake hands, you don't touch people with your left hand, you only touch people with your right hand. All of it, you don't sit like this with your shoe facing somebody, that's an insult. That's all part of language. And so we think of language as, what vocabulary am I using in English and how does it translate to Arabic? No, language is everything to do with how you relate to each other. And I've been told a number of my times in my life, which is in many ways a great affirmation, you'd be a great Muslim. Okay, that is a real affirmation coming from a Muslim and not a confrontational thing. So it's that part of entering into appreciating and celebrating that we're not the same, but that doesn't mean we can't be friends and we can't come to some agreements on moral and ethical issues and stuff like that. We are going to differ on many things, particularly when it comes to politics. But we do that within our own culture. So that's not necessarily a skill that's difficult to work in.
So let's get to some of the ethical stuff, particularly in just a minute. But again, just to stick with this for a minute, then. So if we as Christians see, here is the world as it is, and this is not the way God wants it to be, right? Okay. So a paradigm would be, so I need to be right with God, and then I need to have the Spirit flow through me to change the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But it's God's activity through me is what we would say. If Muslims don't have the conceptual framework of the personal relationship with God, and faith is not fundamentally oriented on the self, and this need to atone for moral sin isn't there, then what is the impetus? How do they get to the world is bad and we need to make it better? What's the move?
Okay, I mean, submitting to God and His will is inevitably going to make things better.
Okay.
And so to the degree in which people, we would use the term rebel, but don't do God's thing,
yep.
That's where things go wrong. And so the cultural community pressure on everybody to conform and do things the same way is really the focus of how they approach what I would loosely term the redemption of the world. Mm-hmm. Is to create this society. And Muslims are convinced that their Islamic society is better, and they look at our culture and it's all this secular stuff, and people walk out of church and they stop acting like Christians, and only when they live in the church. The treatment of women, we look at their treatment of women and we think, oh, it's terrible, they don't allow the women this. They look at our culture and I just say all the nakedness that goes into marketing and stuff like that. And they say, oh, it's horrible, you people. You call yourselves God's people. It's always easy to see what's wrong in the other culture and not even see what's wrong in your own culture. And when you work with people from another culture, regardless, you're going to be faced with that mirror that you hadn't even used before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, how are we doing? Is good? Should we keep going? I can keep working on my questions here, or you got a question? Okay. Wait, Karen.
I really want to appreciate, because Seth keeps bringing me back to where we were at.
Karen, go ahead.
I wondered what prayer is about for a Muslim.
Oh.
Sorry, where is?
What is prayer about for a Muslim?
Thank you. That's very important. Prayer is part of submitting to God. So 5 times a day, a good Muslim is supposed to pray in community, but if he can't, he's supposed to pray alone. The women figure in too, but the focus is always on the males. That's just the culture. And there is a strict ritual. They start with this, they go to that, they have postures that they work on. And then in the midst of that, depending on different things, there is a pause where the Muslim can, if I might say, petition, let God know his worries. And then they finish up with the rest of the ritual. And the ritual starts with the Islamic creed, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God, and then it goes from there. And this is, it's so ubiquitous that it's hard to separate it from everything. But it's on the unity of God, and we are supposed to identify with that oneness of God. But prayer is not about asking God to do what we want or telling God what we want or why he's not doing a very good job about something. It's simply submitting to God formally, if I might say liturgically, and entering into relationship. Now, to be fair, Islam is not one single culture. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have to be realistic and say that the presentation in the book is about the more traditional Arab founding dimension of Islam, but as Islam has moved into the world, translating, if I might use that term, those things, and culturally, I mean, for instance, Ramadan, sunrise to sunset, you don't eat. Well, that's really tough in Norway. So the scholars have gotten together and they set parameters so that Muslims in Norway can fast confidently that they're doing it right. And it's not so here's how you have to do it. It's to give the confidence for the community to know how to celebrate Ramadan together. So you got flexibility, but.
So let's stick on this point, because this is something else that we have tried to talk about a lot and tried to understand. If, again, another foundational, fundamental sort of question that all world faiths have to answer is, we have the revelation such as it was, and times change, right? So we want to stay faithful to whatever the revelation was in its most holy form, and yet we have to ethically face the questions that come up that didn't happen back then, right? So for us as Christians, there's a whole bunch of stuff in Jesus' time, let alone talking about the Hebrew Scriptures, that we don't get because it's culturally situated, okay? But yet we try to be as faithful as we can to what was the revelation of God's love in that time. Then we come to our time, and they didn't face a whole host of questions that we have. LGBTQIA+, creation care and the reality of the climate change, nuclear war, oil, computers, I mean, all this stuff, right? Jesus didn't say, go shut off your computer for whatever, okay? Muslims, as we understand from your book, the goal of being a Muslim is to be as close as possible to the revelation given to Muhammad in the Arabic language as possible. And you don't change from that, right? Except that now Arabian cultures have oil, and they have computers, and they have et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So not only Ramadan, that's an example, but could you help us understand how Muslims have tried to live into this tension in terms of sort of core ideas of the Muslim faith, but also the range? I mean, the Sunnis and the Shias and the Abadis and they're going to be all different, right? And, and Sunnis in one country are going to be different than Sunnis in another country. So how do Muslims try to live into this so that we can understand to relate, to ask those same questions? See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think so. Let's start with Christianity. We have had in our culture, particularly American Christianity, in the 1920s, the massive movement towards fundamentalism, a rejection of change and modernity and things like that, and people still trying to work with that. Well, in Islam, that happened 1250 AD, and the interpretation was sealed at that point. But they still have to deal with modernity. And they have, and Ramadan is a very good example, that each country sets sunrise, sunset timings. Each country sets, because it's based on who sees the moon when the month of Ramadan starts. Well, depending on weather conditions, they're not going to see the moon in Yemen, but they are going to see it so we have to realize that Islam has been able to adapt to locality issues and a number of cultural issues. We were talking about how the Arabian Muslims really kind of poo-poo the Indonesian Muslims, who outnumber them immensely, because they don't do a call to prayer. Somebody up there singing la ilaha illallah and come to prayer. They have a big gong, which is heard throughout the whole village. And that's how they call people to prayer. That is their heritage. And people come and they do their prayers in the mosque, but it's not a minaret. And so the Saudis and some others, they're not good Muslims. But we do the same thing. We have a thing with, you're not a good Christian because you don't do it the way we do it. And the sense that Arabian Islam is the standard for all has often in more recent times even itself come under threat, because the Salafism is this sense of trying to put things back the way of Muhammad, and we get what Americans call ISIS, right? And unfortunately, they did it quite violently. But there is this sense of how do we recreate Muhammad's context and life so that we can imitate it. And the distractions of television and computers, but they are very good at using computers, the ISIS people, So they can justify, as we do, things that aren't really part of our heritage, but we bring it in because it allows us to do our things better. Man's capacity for justifying is incredible. I should say human capacity for justifying is incredible. And Muslims are humans. But it creates paradoxes for them. And there's incredible problems in that paradox.
And so it's at least helpful for us to remember that when we are listening to the news or when we meet someone who's Muslim, that there is a wide diversity of how people have tried to answer this question within the Muslim faith, at least as wide as there is within our own Christian faith, when you compare Amish or whoever, right? So, okay.
Now, I think it's really important what you just said. You meet a Muslim. You don't have a clue to start with, whether he's Sunni, Shia, or you will if you know the names, or how do you know everything to know about this Muslim? It's like saying, oh, well, you're American. From New York, from Atlanta, from Dallas, California. I mean, not all Americans are the same, and that's even really constricting compared to all Muslims. So stereotyping is one of the first and most difficult things to get past. in understanding.
Help us I'm going to ask for other questions, but help us, one of the major questions that we don't really fully appreciate as Americans is Sunni versus Shia, and then Abadi or whoever else. So help us understand the branches of, loosely understood.
Okay. There are two main branches, Sunni and Shia, and then there are a number of smaller things. Ibadi is, interestingly, it came to social expression in what's now Oman and what's now Morocco. I don't know how that happened in history, but the Sunnis would be just more focused on the literalism of the Quran and that's the basic reference with the Hadith. The Sunnah, they would say, the collection of the writings. The Shia are much more focused on, there is a professional elite who help us understand and interpret it. So you could kind of do a Catholic Protestant thing on that. And it's not wrong, but it's different, of course. But as I said, you've got other, Indonesia is a perfect example. There's more Muslims in Indonesia than the whole Middle East. But they have a different expression, a different social expression, a different sense of community. Because Indonesia's 120 different islands, so they have, and different languages and things, but they're all Muslims. And they have their different customs than the kind of the true Arab customs and stuff. But we, in trying to relate to them, it is, if I might say, the point of reference is Arab Islam, and where that goes. And even an Indonesian Muslim who wants to be a good Muslim is going to kind of move more towards the Arabic understanding of Islam and actually studying Arabic so he can get the true story. And they kind of look down on the need to translate in order to understand. But the other side, they're pragmatic about it. Not everybody's going to learn Arabic, so we translate and we allow people to use the translations. And so there are differences. Pretty much everywhere you go, you're going to find that Islam takes a different character. Let me just say there are more Muslims in England than in Kuwait. The way we view it all is really not in touch with the real thing, because our media just presents this monolithic thing which isn't presented very well in the first place. So how do we get past that? And I really would appeal to the idea, get to know the person. And you're talking to a person, not a culture. Now, in order to know the person, he's going to want you to understand his culture. He's going to talk to you about his family, or she, either way. I'm sorry, I don't want to do that. But there's an element in all of this of, you're not going to understand simply by reading a book, good as the book may be, but there's an element of we misunderstand each other so easily, much less somebody who comes from a different background.
And so this is especially helpful for us to remember in Michigan, in southern Michigan, where one of the largest populations of people from the Arabian area of the world is now located, right, in southern Michigan. And Yemeni and Coldwater, Michigan, and over on the east side, Dearborn, and we got all, yeah, go ahead.
Well, let me just say that the original Arab migration into the auto industry were all Christians.
Yes, right.
Middle Eastern Christians.
Right.
And when you meet someone, how do you know if he's a Christian or a Muslim?
Yeah, right.
So there's just assumptions and stereotypes that all get in the way. So you got to go the extra step.
And as an aside too, this is one of the things that I've been engaged with Israel-Palestine and many other Christians in the Middle East. You know, at the time of the founding of the nation of Israel, 20% of the population of the country was Christian Palestinian, and now it's, well, it was less than 2% 20 years ago, so I don't know what it is now. But most of people who migrated out of Palestine came to either places in Europe like Germany or Norway, but also to Chicago. There are a lot of Palestinian Christians in that Chicago area, and then also here across southern Michigan. And then this is also true for, I mean, I told you in Marshall we hosted an Iraqi Presbyterian pastor in the time of about 2001, 2003, when Gulf War II happened, and he couldn't go home, you know, and so he had studied in Cairo, and so so Christian Arabs are fleeing the Middle East, have fled for a half a century or more in numbers. So that's interesting. Other questions? Yes, sure.
Thank you so much for writing the book. We're enjoying studying it so much. The question that, first of all, I love the part about Islam that has the infinite respect for the ineffability of God. That it's such a state of humility that we all should have. My question is about Muhammad came on the scene 500 years after Christianity had a foothold. Is that about right? And so they seem to have rejected the deification of Jesus the man as a prophet. And then they moved to Muhammad as another prophet. Can you talk about how that happened when they were birthing, much like the beginning of Christianity, that moment of Islam growing up right then, moving away from Christianity?
Okay, Muhammad, in his profession, met Christians because he traveled up and down the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And he was familiar with monasteries because he stayed in monasteries, always traveling, et cetera, et cetera. So he gets the business of, they pray at different times of day. They get the idea that there is only one God, but what's this Trinity? I'm not going to bother with that. That's too complicated. Yeah, he just left that out. But of course, Muslims would say that wasn't Muhammad making any choices at all. That was God's revelation through the angel. That's what they would say. So, you know, don't put too much on Muhammad, because the Muslims would say Muhammad didn't create Islam. Muhammad responded to God fully. That's what they would say. Muhammad built his life around what he understood God wanted for the perfect society. And the hadith is the place to get that. When you have had your lunch and you lie down to take a rest before afternoon prayers, don't cross your ankles, because that's disrespectful. People can look, because they wore a galabea or a gown, whatever, and they can see too far up your legs if you cross your ankles. Okay, so it was a purity matter. And you know, when you actually look at it, it does make some sense. But the hadith is full of that kind of stuff. How do we live in a way that gives due respect to each other and to God, inheritance, all kinds of things. And so as time went, after Islam became a community, and they kept coming to Muhammad and say, well, what about this? And what about that? And so they collected. Now, Muhammad dies. He had these 4 really close friends. And they each in turn inherited the leadership of the community. And there was a really strong, and this is the Sunni Shiite part of it in some ways, there's a really strong thing on the leaders of the community must be people who are appointed by Muhammad and again by his successors, not his children. It's not an inherited leadership. Well, the Shia took a different stance. No, it should be Muhammad's, the business of his son is another whole problem, but it was about inheriting Muhammad's person. And so that's one of the principal divides. It's that very simplified description, I have to say. But nevertheless, And so even from the very beginning, there were divisions within the community. And some of them became enhanced terribly by geographical issues. You know, they didn't have the internet to talk about it. It's just something happened here, and 6 months later they heard about it over here. You know, and so the formation of the community was not. Well, it's kind of like our own community. Again, you get back to let's do some parallels. We know about the Declaration of Independence. It started something. How many years before we got the Constitution? 13 years. We forget that. And it was a hugely argued process. And part of it was slavery or not. Okay, this is very much the formation of our freedom for all men are created equal, and all this that we read in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence didn't really actually count for everybody, much less women. Okay? And so, you know, we look at our situation and say, we're the best, you know, we've done this and we've done that. They do the same thing. It took time for their culture to become established, and they were able to, if I might say, unite the pagan disparate tribes of the area and create a culture out of chaos. And their history says this was a really good thing. And they elevated the position of women considerably out of that chaotic context. And so they're very proud of that. You know, when we say, well, you shouldn't do this about women, you shouldn't do that about women. And in the book, I make the point of, you know, we are not real happy about the way they force women to dress. Because men don't dress there like they dress here. You know, I would not go out with my shoulders showing or my heaven forbid, my knees showing. That's not a public manifestation of how you interact in society. So, you know, we simplify things, again, based on what we've been told, and we read that into the picture and form our opinions. So if you do take the time to study how the society evolved over time, and more recently, how it has been terribly, terribly conflicted over modernity and stuff. I'm going to do the 1979 thing.
Okay.
How many of you know what went wrong in the world in 1979? Okay, the first one that we all know about is Iran and the Ayatollah Khomeini coming into power and what that meant for Iran and Shia Islam and the confrontation between Shia and Sunni. The Russians invading Afghanistan, which created the Mujahideen and the militarization of Islam against this ungodly communism to support the Afghani people. And, you know, forget that other people had tried it in the past, the Afghans always won and everything, but there was just this whole thing of uniting Islam in this really fundamentalist capacity. The other thing that hardly anybody knows about, that there was an uprising of fundamentalism in Saudi Arabia that occupied the Grand Mosque because Saudi Arabian society was so corrupt, in their view. And they tried to impose this really deep fundamentalist stuff. And let's just say the Saudi royal family took care of it by slaughtering them all. But they did change all of their policies. And Saudi Arabia tried to become the purest form of Islam, at least as far as people could see, so that they didn't have that accusation to respond to. And that's where Osama bin Laden came from. You know, Osama bin Laden's enemy was the Saudi royal family, and by proxy, America's support for the Saudi royal family. And this tension within Islam, particularly those three things, has affected the whole world, and we don't know about it. It's not featured in the way we try to explain why the world is what it is today.
And so, to get to politics just a little bit, whether you're Democrat, Republican, whatever, so then we have this attitude that we're going to go do something over in name your Arabian country, right? And this is going to fix it. from our perspective when we don't even get the cultural context that you're talking about, and so there's no way that it can, there will be repercussions that we don't even imagine,
Thank
right?
you.
Because we don't get that. There's
Yeah.
a whole layer of everything, because we go in not with our questions, but with our assumptions. Other questions that you have? Yeah, go ahead, Sharon. Please, other questions? Yes, Leonard. Coming to you, Leonard. Here we go. There we go.
Thank you. Hi, Father.
Yes, please.
Pleasure meeting you.
Thank you.
Anyway, I have known people that were part of the Muslim community in the past, and understand that the Shiite and the Sunnis are at odds. Was Muhammad? I believe he was a Shiite. No, a Shiite, right?
Well, I think most Muslims would say that Muhammad was Sunni,
And
partly because he centered in Arabia.
okay.
Okay.
One of the things, you remember when there was an issue where Muhammad couldn't go to Mecca and he had to go down to Medina? That story, you know about that story?
Okay. In Mecca, Mecca was kind of what we would think of as Jerusalem. It was a pilgrimage site
Yeah.
where the tribes came to worship their gods. And there were, I think, depending on who you talk to, but the popular thing, there were 99 idols in that thing that's covered now in black. And Muhammad said, this is all wrong. Okay, and you go back to Ephesians and some other things that we know in our own history is, wait a minute, these guys have come and they're interfering with our business by preaching this new religion.
Yes.
So Muhammad was seriously persecuted in Mecca. So he migrated, which is the term they use, to Medina, and those who were on his side went with him, and the Medina people welcomed him. Mm-hmm. And that's when Islam became a society.
Yes.
And he became, I wouldn't call it a king, but the leader of a community. Okay. Well, one of the first things he did is go back to Mecca and have war with those other people.
Yes.
And he won. Okay, and that's what got things really going.
Sometimes when the Muslims, when they come in those meetings, I know back years ago, but they would always tell the story about when Muhammad couldn't go to Mecca, he had to go down to Medina, you know.
Yeah, well,
And
Medina simply means city. Okay, I mean, that's part of the whole thing that we don't get.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Who's got a question? What does this spark for you, for your understand our faith, understand the, yes, Janet.
The Muslims I have known here are from Egypt. They are extremely academic and hardworking. I think they get into the best colleges. I think because of their commitment probably to wanting a strong community.
Well, the strong community definitely
Yeah,
a factor.
yeah,
yes.
I think that. I mean, they become physicians and they want a strong community. My question is, who decides when a Muslim is out of line in their behavior toward a detrimental community? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I get where
Okay,
you're going.
who decides when a Muslim is acting in a manner that is detrimental to the community?
Oh, okay, right. I mean, that brings in the whole shame factor, okay. Now, I would say a couple of things. We know the Chinese community, same thing. The whole family really works on the kids to study, whatever, to become a doctor or a professional person. All right. The Japanese, I mean, it's that community thing. And the people that we notice are the most successful ones. If you're going to emigrate from Iraq and come to America, you've got to bring something to America before America will receive you. We don't want people coming who are going to be on, what do you call it? We have to give them money.
Well, welfare.
Thank you. was going to use the dole,
The
the
dole.
British thing. But anyway, and this is one of the things that affected the migration movements from the 1880s onwards. Christians were the ones who had education. And so Christians migrated far more than Muslims, even though they were a smaller group to start with. And so in the Middle East, it's really only been the last, say, 20 years that there's been significant migration of Muslim Arabs to this country. And they have gone other places as well. But I think we do need to understand that that kid studied and whatever. He did not go out and get a job. He stayed home. The family supported him so he could study and become a doctor and go to America, and then later on we'll get visas to go to America too. Mm-hmm. But how do we preserve the future of our family in this crazy economy and corruption and war and everything else? We want one of our best and brightest to succeed over here so that we as a family can live into that prosperity. So it is a family thing. Mm. But of course the kids got to work really hard.
Conformity again, you're conforming to the pressure.
Yeah.
So the beginning of her question was, who decides when Muslims' behavior is inconsistent with the community values?
Who decides when there's consistency or inconsistency?
Okay, decisions essentially are all, I'm getting old, I can't find the right word when I want to. Consensus. Mm. So the family will get together and decide who's the best bet here for the promotion of this one. But have you heard the concept of honor killing? Mm-hmm. It's because usually the woman has done something which brings shame onto the community, and it's not that they decide she's been a bad girl, it's the neighbors are talking. And the neighbors are making problems. And when mother went to the market, nobody would sell to her. How do we purge this dishonorable stuff from our identity? And unfortunately, and that's a very worst case scenario, but it's the one we hear about. It's not difficult to identify someone who has shamed the family because the whole community is involved in the shaming. Now, we have this again in our society in some different places. The Amish have this very firmly. Frank, I grew up good, strong. My grandmother was Irish Catholic, grandfather was German Catholic, and they had so much struggle because they married outside their nationality, not out of the church. But all the time when I was growing up, the answer was, because you're a Schwartz. We don't do this, or we do this. It was a collective identity on our family and our heritage. Grandmother would never approve of that. We have it here, but it's been diminished.
Well, and so as I listen to this, I think this is one of the things, again, that we from the Western world don't fully appreciate, because we look at honor killings, for example, and we say, there was to be fair, it's often women who get killed, she was exercising her freedom of choice, right? And she's killed for it, and isn't that horrible, right? And I'm not saying we're wrong, but from the other perspective, it's not about the individual, it's about the preservation of the whole society, right? And then this has to be corrected because of the preservation of the whole society, which is interestingly why Samaritans and Jews in the Bible are so much in conflict, because Samaritans actually were Jews, right? But then the history gets complicated. They went off to Babel, whatever, and so they intermarried. So the Samaritans are so hated because they're the closest to the Jews and the greatest threat to the Jewish society itself. Does that make sense? right? So we're not saying it's right or wrong. It's a whole different way of seeing it. Okay, one more question. I got a couple more things, and then we're going to be done because we're almost done. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
My name is Eugenia, my first time here.
Good, Eugenie. Great
But
to have
as
you.
we talk about, there's a lot of cultural studies with Muslims and all that. But as you keep talking, this will be like a comment or contribution. It looks like Muslims are living what they believe. They're living out their faith. Christians, we tend to say we are Christians, and our deeds don't match up most of the time.
Okay.
We are separated, not so much Presbyterian, as you said earlier, right? Because we are Presbyterians or because we are Pentecostals, we have created this grade and conflict among the Christianity in itself. Everywhere we can't even agree to common things. And so, in other words, we have to learn to live out the word, be the doers of it. So, Acts chapter 2, Acts of the Apostles, is by their deeds that the community called them Christians. It's not just because they come to a specific place of worship. So in order to focus on all these things, trying to discriminate people or trying to push people away, or they don't look like the way we look or dress the way we look, we turn not to want to understand them and the way of life. I'm a Ghanaian by birth, and I grew up in Ghana. Our culture honor God. We pour libation. That's the real prayer, right? So pouring libation, we honor God. We have names of God, omnipotent, omnipresent, Alpha and Omega. Just because you are not understanding what I'm saying at the moment doesn't mean I'm not honoring the God. So Muslims, in short, Muslims are living out their faith. Whatever they get a little bit of whatever faith, they grasp onto it and let it show. Where is our community as Christians? What is the faith that we are living out today? Thank you.
That's good, Eugenie, yeah. Well, do you want to respond or no? Yeah, I mean, what it makes me think about is that, and this isn't exactly what you were saying, but this is what I hear and what you're saying, is that in the end, we were talking last night that, we need, when we're in interfaith dialogue, when we're in cross-cultural understandings, whether it's Christian or not, to always understand that I am not like you and not presume that I am. So if I were to come into a Muslim conversation and say, oh, let's all figure out the way that we're all similar and whatever, that is always laced with my biases as a white American Christian, that I'm putting onto the other person, right? So we always need to be careful about that. And one of the things that I kind of glean from all of this that we're trying to work on here is that it's perhaps overly simplified, but in the end, Muslims and Christians and Buddhists for that matter and Jews and all, ultimately we all get to an ethical question. That is, how are we living in the world, right? That's what all of our faiths try to get us to. And though we have different ways of getting there and different foundational ideas to get there, I would believe that we Christians, as we talk about here, want to work for all creation and all people to flourish abundantly, whatever we mean by that. Muslims, I would say, probably are kind of going for kind of the similar thing. They want all society to flourish abundantly, right? And so if that can be a starting point for at least our dialogue, respecting that there are profound differences and we're not assuming one is the same, I think the ethical question of how are we living it in the end can be maybe a helpful starting point. So in that vein, kind of, I have two final questions, okay? So just hint that we're wrapping up here. So I am personally very interested, and this could be very esoteric, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on this if this is a time for a conversation for another time. But one of the other books that we read in noodling, y'all remember, was Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, which from a Western perspective is all about moral psychology and how we build our moral arguments. And the fundamental assumption is that whatever decisions we make however we act in the world, is ultimately not a rational choice, it's an emotion.
Yeah.
So the anger, the fear, the stuff that we're talking about, right? And often what happens is that the mind rationalizes what we're already feeling, right? So we're always acting out of our emotions, but we rationalize it. So this is a way to understand anthropology, who we are as human beings, that makes certain assumptions, right? That is founded on an individual, right?
Yes.
That is an individual. Moral, like each individual has a compilation of these moral attributes that we sort of lift up: loyalty, sanctity, whatever. And that frames how we act. Would Muslims even look at it that way? Or is there anthropological sort of assumption about who we are so based in community and the social pressures, the social conformity to make a choice, that they're not even going to actually talk about the kind of moral psychology, Jonathan Haidt kind of stuff that we're talking about? And this is, by the way, not to say one is better than the other. It's a curiosity for me, as I shared last time we went in noodling. It's a curiosity for me that we've built this whole construct, and is it a construct
It is.
that much of the rest of the world may not, like if you go to East Asia, would they even have the same kind of, see what I'm saying?
Yep. And I would agree, basically what you've said is, it isn't relevant. Because we have some idea that if we can somehow educate ourselves or inform ourselves better, we'll be better world citizens. Well, yeah, but God so loved the world. Actually, in Greek, the word is cosmos,
Yep.
not just humans.
Yep.
We aren't global people here. We live in a particular community, in a particular location, and that's our frame of reference for the globe. I would say Muslims in the Middle East are much more tuned to the rest of the world, partly because, I mean, our problem is we're such a huge country, and we have a huge economy, and we can do America first and get away with it. The rest of the world knows that they can't. You have to be interactive. You have to learn these 3 languages if you're going to get ahead. How many of us speak more than 1 language? I'm not going to do any nasty stuff here, but there's this sense of how we approach definitions in the mind, and I think that the important thing of this book, I mean, I've not read it, but the idea that we put too much emphasis on the mind. We need to actually understand and appreciate how much the heart, to use the analogy, actually affects our decisions, our wants, our needs, fears, all those kinds of things, and how that drives our social interaction far more than how we think. And it's important to actually see that. The Muslim, Arab Muslim, to be more specific, because their decisions and ethics and all are vested in the community, you don't hear I, you hear we. And the interesting dimension is when, say, an Iraqi Muslim moves out of Iraq and all the problems of Iraq comes to America, and what does he retain of his culture and what does he leave behind? And that's a very interesting conversation. There's 15,000 Iraqi Christians in a suburb right near where I live, and I'm part of a NGO to support Christians in Iraq. Can I get them to support their friends back in Iraq? They'll support their own family, but not the community of Christianity. They've left. We're done with Iraq. Thank you very much. I find that astounding, but they have recreated that within the migrant community here in the States. And they've carried their particular religious customs with them. Most of them are Chaldean Christians. And they really major on being good Iraqi Christians, but it's separated from Iraq itself now. It's a dilemma. So they are I say more obviously motivated and in their ethical choices, again, by the community and the community values. And they're not trying to separate the mind from the heart. It's just all one thing. So, and Muslims probably even more so, I'll put, because they're less sequential in their way of thought. They're more of associative in their thinking, which goes with this whole consensus thing and all that. I mean, what do we learn in school? We learn to think sequentially. We learn logic. If this is true, then that's true. But if that's true, then this must be true. That's how we learn. It's how we express ourselves academically. It's not a Middle Eastern idea at all. You know, we do this. We think this. And it's affirmed by the we. And it's very hard for us, I say, to appreciate how strong that is, because we just don't think that way. I think a book like this would be a good thing for Americans to read, because it challenges that primary approach to thought process and education and expression. Okay, I mean, for me, pastor, sometimes we get into this thing called stewardship. And Jesus says, where your money is, your heart will be. We approach it, where your heart is, your money will be. No wonder we have trouble, because we're not doing it the right way. Actually, for me, I say to people, look at where your money is, and that'll tell you and everybody else where your heart is. Now, in the Middle East, that's a community thing, because everybody knows. And it's an honor and shame thing. I love the Ghanaians and Nigerians. When they give their offering, if nobody goes around with a plate, they come up, put their envelope in the plate. Everybody has seen that process. It's a public manifestation. It's just a different way of doing things. But it's a community thing, not an individualistic thing. It's funny how even kind of the simplest things that we don't think have anything to do with this, in the long run, you can't. It's all integrated. You can't separate this from that, which we do in our secular society. You know, I got my Christian hat on, I wear my Christian clothes. When I go home, I'm going to get rid of these Christian clothes and put on something a little more comfortable. But we live these compartmentalized lives in America, which is far less of an issue in other cultures in general, Islam in particular in this context. We have a lot to learn from the rest of the world. Whereas we approach the whole thing as we have a lot to teach the rest of the world, even missions. Thank you very much. But the best thing about being a missionary is what you learn, not what you teach. You can't get around that if you're going to be authentic. But again, we're so individualistic, self-absorbed. I'm going there to do a great thing for these people. That's not mission. I'm going there to be with these people through their struggles, through their celebrations, to be one with them, just as Jesus did and came to be one with us through our celebrations and struggles and everything that's good and bad about the world. And then together, then we can change that. It's called the gospel. And it's called the body of Christ carrying on the work of Christ. But we can't do that by ourselves.
So that feels like it's a good place to end, except there's one more question that we've asked, and that is, Christianity is a religion of love. Is the Muslim way of approaching faith a religion of love?
No, not. It's just not the deal. They know love. They know what love is, but they wouldn't characterize God as love. So that's a scriptural thing for us, but I dare say I would challenge that we are people of love.
Okay.
We can be loving.
Fair enough.
And I forget who I was talking to at coffee time. I asked, okay, what does Jesus teach us about love? Love God and love our neighbor as ourselves. We got to add that as ourselves, as Americans. No, that's Jesus passing a test of the religious leaders to say, how well do you know the law of Moses? What did Moses teach? Jesus, on the night before he died, twice, John's gospel, said, my command for you is that you love other people the way I have loved you. That is a pretty high bar to jump over. And do we ever measure up? But unless we actually embrace the challenge, we're not going to make it. And that's, somebody says something, how they know that they're Christians. Do we love each other the way Jesus did? Do we forgive the way Jesus did? Love isn't a happy emotion. Love is the hard work of forgiving and accepting and including and so this is, I think the American church has really got to recover what we've lost in community, not in contrast to Islam or whatever. It's just something that we need to do because we've moved far from where we should be. And in doing so, we'll be better equipped and, frankly, just by being, we'll do a better job of being Jesus in the society and carrying on his work. But it's none of what we do. It's the kind of people we are. It's not, okay, it's great, and I think it's wonderful that you have this program to feed the hungry. But don't make such a big deal out of it. It's what we should do. It's kind of like, yeah, you should brush your teeth before you go to bed. It's not special, if I can say. Of course it is. I mean, people got to work together as a community to assist and include these other people who are not part of our community. And how do we include them? We invite them in. That's all wonderful stuff, but let's take the self out of it, and then it will become even better.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Thank you really very much. And thank you for your time. Thank you for your heart, your mind, your experience. We have grown by your life experience. And again, if you want to continue the conversation as such, and if you don't have a copy of his book and you like it, let me know. His sister Diane can help and help us get more copies if we need it. It is in our church library as well. So thank you, Bill.
Well, thank you.
Peace be with you upon your journey from here.
So. Wa alaikum salam.
Alaikum salam, yes.
I want to ask you, is this tallness in the family? It's just